if our friends and visitors could come on in and get a seat, we'll close those back doors. Just to hold, or the front doors, I guess. I want to call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology and welcome you all for our Media Ownership in the 21st Century hearing, and thank our witnesses for taking time to be here. We really appreciate your counsel and your testimony. I'll open with my opening statement, and then we'll move to Ms. Eshu for hers. What are the founding of Microsoft, the first episode of Saturday Night Live, and the establishment of the broadcast newspaper cross-ownership ban have in common? Well, they are all about ready to turn 40 because they all took place in 1975. But where Microsoft has innovated and moved past a world where MS-DOS was the state of the art, Saturday Night Live continues to reinvent itself as an essential piece of Americana. The media ownership rules persist as though the Internet simply did not exist. Our laws need to reflect the reality of the world we live in today, not the world of the Ford administration. It is my sincere hope that today's discussion can spur us to rationalize the rules and regulations for a media industry that serves consumers in this century and not in the last. The Ford administration is noted there with one chairman of the subcommittee posed with Mr. Ford, just to put in context how things have changed beyond just my hairline. In today's media environment, traditional media like Bend, Oregon, thank you for taking that down now, traditional media like Bend, Oregon's KTVZ TV and the town's Bulletin newspaper compete with Twitter, the Drudge Report, the Huffington Post, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. You can get it all right there. We live in an era of 24-hour news cycle and on-demand national media. But our laws assume a world where local newspapers and broadcast stations are so influential that economies of scale are dangerous to the public interest. While proponents of the status quo express their love of localism and the laws intended to guarantee it, I fear that laws intended to ensconce our love of local media are in fact loving it to death. Promoting localism is a goal that we all share. But localism is not cheap. Producing the kind of high-quality content that's been the hallmark of American broadcasting is an expensive labor of love for local broadcasters and newspapers. And as Americans' habits have changed, so too should the way we look at local media. We live in a competitive landscape where increasingly we cherry-pick articles, we scroll through feeds and aggregators, and we have multiple national news programming options, and we DVR almost everything to time-shift the programming that we love. It's a different world. So why don't our media laws reflect these changes? The fact is the FCC's tried to change these rules as early as its 2002 review of media ownership rules when it recognized the competitive force of the Internet. The Commission would have done away with the ban on cross-ownership of a daily newspaper and a broadcast station and expanded the caps on local ownership of television and radio stations. But the courts overturned the FCC's proposed rule, not because it believed that repeal was unreasonable. In fact, the court determined that, and I quote, reasoned analysis supports the Commission's determination that the blanket ban on newspaper broadcast cross-ownership was no longer in the public interest, close quote. The Third Circuit threw out the proposed new rules because it thought the Commission relied too heavily on the Internet as a significant competitive factor. I wonder what the court would say today if the same proposal were before it. Now that the newspaper's annual revenues are down more than half since 2003, would the same bench consider the Internet a significant competitive factor now that the average online video ad often outprices national TV dayparts? Sadly, following two court losses, it seems that for a while the FCC simply gave up on trying to save this industry from antiquated regulation. The Commission failed to complete the 2010 quadrennial review, its statutorily mandated review of media ownership rules, and instead doubled down by making changes that make it more difficult for local media to compete. The Commission's recent decisions to unwind many joint sales agreements and to look askance at shared service arrangements ignore the realities of the broadcast business and are affirmatively harmful to the localism they purport to protect. I'm happy to see that the Commission intends to return to reasoned rulemaking consistent with its statutory mandate. Chairman Wheeler has announced his intention to comply with the law and complete the 2014 quadrennial review in a timely manner. And while the law is very specific in the Commission's mandate to deregulate media ownership where warranted, given the recent set of FCC decisions, I am, to quote the man for whom this room is named, comforted very little. Without relief, I fear that local broadcast and newspaper companies will continue to struggle against unregulated competitors whose businesses are not hamstrung by decades-old regulatory assumptions. Newspaper classified advertising peaked in 2000 at $19.6 billion. In 2012, classified advertising brings in $4.6 billion. That's a 77% drop in revenues just from classified advertising, primarily due to shifts in classifieds to such internet entities as Craigslist. Unsurprisingly, hundreds of newspapers have shuttered operations or migrated to digital only since 2007, and the U.S. has lost 62 daily newspapers since 2004. We're all committed to promoting a local media industry that's healthy, to fostering competition, localism, and diversity of voices, and to ensuring that local media continues to serve the needs of their communities. But pretending that laws designed for an era before smartphones and the internet will get the job done is an effective death sentence for many local media outlets. I'd like to thank our witnesses again for joining us today to offer their opinions on these matters. We appreciate your taking the time, and we look forward to your testimony. With that, I'd recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the witnesses, and thank you for being willing to testify today at this important hearing that the chairman has called. I believe that one of the most important manifestations of a vibrant democracy is that there are many voices speaking to the many. And so whatever I say in my opening statement really fits in with that principle because I think it's such an essential one. And I think it's one that should guide us in everything that we do relative to these undertakings in the examination of media ownership in the 21st century. In an era when corporate media outlets have become increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few conglomerates, our goal, and the chairman mentioned this, should be to promote localism, advance competition, and encourage diversity, not to roll back what few protections we have in these key areas. I'd like to put forward some facts that I find troubling. Despite a national broadcast television ownership cap, 10 station groups now own over 650 stations, or nearly half of all commercial full-power broadcast stations in the United States. The source of that is Free Press. 10 companies control 55% of all local TV advertising revenues. 25% of the nation's 952 local news stations do not produce their newscasts themselves. You combine these statistics with the fact that 20 out of the top 25 news websites rely heavily or even exclusively on news gathered from traditional media sources such as a daily newspaper, broadcast network, or a cable news network, and you have a picture of what I think is an unhealthy media landscape. So as the FCC takes steps to close existing loopholes in its rules, I'm pleased that the agency is moving forward with its review of our nation's broadcast ownership rules. The completion of the long overdue 2010 quadrennial review and the 2014 review will ensure the FCC can fully assess the impact of further consolidation on ownership, diversity, and localism in our nation's media system. And while some have criticized the FCC for cracking down on sidecar deals before concluding its 2010 review, I think that the agency has an obligation to enforce the existing rules on the books, regardless of the outcome of its review. Congress has long entrusted the FCC with upholding the core values of competition, localism, and diversity of media. And while the media landscape may change, and we welcome those changes, the role that these values play in advancing public disclosure and strengthening our democracy, I think should remain intact. So again, thank you to our witnesses, and I would like to not only submit for the record a letter written by Common Cause, Mr. Chairman, supporting FCC action on JSAs, and I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Butterfield.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I thank the ranking member for yielding this morning, and certainly thank you for your passion on diversity. It's very much appreciated. Mr. Chairman, I offer the following statement. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans own a combined 3% of all full-power commercially owned and operated TV stations here in the United States, and the number for radio are not much better. Access to capital, consolidation, and outdated ownership rules further stifle minority ownership. Increasing diversity ownership is important. It ensures that content will be delivered in formats that mirror the cultural experiences of our citizens and generates economic opportunities for the nation, particularly as these companies create and maintain jobs. The future of our media will also be dependent upon our ability to factor in the impact of emerging and evolving digital technologies on traditional media models. The FCC regularly says that diversity is one of its objectives, but the 2014 quadrennial NPRM doesn't reflect that commitment. Some proposals, including legislative ones pending for 20 years, were reduced to footnotes. Many of those proposals were supported by the FCC's own Diversity Advisory Committee. I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, the FCC's long-awaited further notice of proposed rulemaking for 2014, if not done correctly, will seek to gather data that will help us to address the disparities that exist in minority media ownership. We must increase meaningful media ownership opportunities for people of color. That's the point I'm trying to make. Thank you very much. I yield back to you, to the ranking member.
And I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I failed to do one thing. If I momentarily could ask unanimous consent to include in the hearing into the record a letter dated June 10th, 2014, addressed to you and to the ranking member.
I believe so, yes, without objection.
All right. Thank you.
Are there any members on our side seeking opening statement? Okay. Mr. Waxman, I would turn to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Americans have more choices today than ever before about where to get news, information, entertainment. Broadband and mobile platforms are altering how content is produced and consumed, but these incredible new innovations do not alter key policy goals, promoting localism, diversity, and competition in the media. These core values represent a commitment that stretches all the way back to the founding of our country. They have animated the FCC's policies for nearly a century. A commitment to localism means timely delivery of news and information relevant to our daily lives, such as emergency alerts in a time of crisis. Competition means original, in-depth reporting that not only informs and educates the public, but helps distinguishes the quality of journalism. Striving for diversity helps the delivery of a wealth of perspectives that more closely reflect the diverse makeup and experiences of our community. The FCC's long-standing media cross-ownership rules are tools for preserving these values. Despite the wonder and power of the Internet, broadcasters and newspapers continue to be the dominant sources for local news and information across old and new medium. That makes these rules relevant even today. Under both Democrats and Republicans, the FCC has tried to revise the media ownership rules, but the agency has little success in navigating the legal, political, and resource challenges in meeting the congressional directive to review these rules every 4 years. Chairman Wheeler has appropriately set a deadline to complete the long overdue 2010 quadrennial review and the currently pending 2014 quadrennial review. As the agency works to complete these reviews, I believe it's time for Congress to examine whether this statutory mandate is still helpful or necessary. One constructive step the FCC has recently taken is closing a loophole created by the proliferation of joint sales agreements between broadcasters. The FCC struck the right balance in adopting rule changes to end JSAs manufactured solely to evade the media ownership rules, while allowing truly beneficial ones to continue through waivers. The committee worked on a bipartisan basis in the recently reported satellite reauthorization bill to provide incentives for broadcasters to file timely requests for waivers and the FCC to expeditiously act on them. A key consideration for the FCC should be helping ensure the health of the newspaper sector, which has been challenged by the growth of online news. A broadcast company that wants to invest in a newspaper could be a boon to a struggling newspaper, but one that wants to raid its assets could hasten its demise. These are not just theoretical questions. Late last year, the Tribune Corporation, the owner of the Los Angeles Times, other newspapers, and broadcast stations across the country, announced that they would be spinning off its newspaper holdings, including the LA Times. The original terms would have forced the LA Times to rent its own building from the Tribune Company and to borrow over $300 million to pay a cash dividend to the Tribune Corporation. I raised questions and consulted with independent media experts who advised that the terms could cripple the LA Times. To its credit, the Tribune Corporation has recently reduced the size of the cash payment it will demand from the newspaper, LA and other newspapers. I hope it will take further steps to ensure the viability of the Times before the deal is complete. Finally, our discussion today would be incomplete without an examination of the abysmal state of media ownership diversity. Women and minorities represent a tiny fraction of the owners and decision makers in the media companies that shape our national discourse. The FCC has had great difficulty crafting policies that could improve ownership diversity and survive legal challenge. I hope today's witnesses can bring some fresh thinking and new ideas to help advance this issue, which is so critical for a healthy democracy. I thank all the witnesses for being here today. I must apologize in advance that I have to be present at another subcommittee and won't be here for all of your testimony. I'll try to get back for questions, but I appreciate your participation. I look forward to reviewing what you have to say, both orally and your written submissions as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'll back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. And I will turn now to the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Latta, for opening comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding today's hearing, and I appreciate all the witnesses being with us today. The media landscape, much like many other sectors in the communications and technology industry, has evolved considerably over the last 20 years. With the introduction of the Internet and digital technology, we have seen convergence, increased competition, innovative content delivery services, and rapidly shifting preferences and consumer demand come to define the media market. However, many of the laws that govern this space are outdated. As a result, longtime industry participants that are subject to these rules and regulations are placed at a competitive disadvantage to newer market entrants. This has thwarted their ability to flexibly and quickly respond and compete in this dynamic marketplace. A particular concern is the FCC has been negligent in completing its mandatory review of the media market that could help address today's competitive realities. As we continue our efforts to examine the Communications Act and consider updates to the law that would better reflect the 21st century communications landscape, I look forward to the hearing from our witnesses today and the current regulatory framework governing media ownership and the impact that it's having on businesses, consumers, and the economy. And Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'd yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
I want to thank my colleague. I want to welcome you all here. There is no reason why the 2010 and 2014 review, quadrennial review, has not been filed. It's just not complying with the law, and it's a failure of the bureaucracy and the federal government to do its job. Having said that, one reason why, because this sector is moving so fast. I mean, how do you get a handle on it? Late breaking story last night. How did I find out about it? Someone did a Twitter feed that one of my staff members picked up and emailed to me. I didn't get it over broadcast. I didn't get it over cable. I didn't get it over radio. I definitely didn't get it out of print media. I got it out of this new world age of information flow. There is more access to information now than ever before. these media ownership rules stifle the ability for localism in rural America. I look forward to this hearing, and I thank you all for coming.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All the opening statements are concluded, and we'll now go to testimony from our witnesses. And again, we thank you all very much for the work you've put into your testimony. We'll start off with Mr. William T. Lake, who's the Chief of the Media Bureau of the Federal Communications Commission. Mr. Lake, we're delighted to have you here before the subcommittee. Pull that microphone pretty close to your mouth or we won't be able to hear your fine words, sir. So thank you, and please, we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member.
You really are going to have to pull this just about like that.
How's that? Okay.
That's much better.
Good morning, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Bill Lake. I'm the Chief of the Media Bureau at the FCC, and I'm very happy to be with you today. I'd like to highlight a few points from my written statement about the actions that the Commission and the Media Bureau took in March relating to media ownership. First, the quadrennial review. The FCC is very aware of its responsibility to review its media ownership rules every 4 years. As you know, in March, the Commission began its most recent review, adopting a further notice that builds on the record of the ongoing 2010 proceeding. The further notice analyzes the evidence to date on each of the rules and discusses the diversity issues remanded to the Commission by the Third Circuit. I recognize that some observers, including members of the subcommittee, are concerned that the Commission has yet to complete its 2010 quadrennial review. As Chairman Wheeler noted in March, the Commission's inability to complete that review was not for lack of effort. We began the proceeding early in November 2009, compiled an extensive record, and circulated a proposed order in 2012, which remained before the Commission for over a year but failed to receive a majority. The further notice will enable all interested parties to supplement the record with information about the 2014 marketplace. The Chairman has committed to present recommendations to the Commissioners by June 30, 2016. Second, Shared Services Agreements, or SSAs. As part of the further notice, the Commission sought to improve its understanding of the sharing of services between separately owned TV stations. The Commission does not now require SSAs to be disclosed, and that makes it hard for us or the public to know what impact these agreements may have on our policies. The further notice invites comment on whether and how best to disclose SSAs. Third, TV Joint Sales Agreements, or JSAs. The Commission also adopted a report and order on TV JSAs. JSAs are agreements between stations in which one station sells advertising time on behalf of the other, typically all of it. Unlike SSAs, they are well known to the Commission. We have long recognized our duty to identify any interests that give holders a realistic potential to influence a station's programming or operations. We treat such interests as attributable. That is, we count the stations as being commonly owned for purposes of our ownership rules. The Commission tentatively concluded in 2004 that it should attribute TV JSAs just as it had done for radio JSAs in 2003. The rationale is that someone who controls a station's main source of revenue has a significant potential to influence the station's operations. Based on the record, and in light of the growing prevalence of TV JSAs, the Commission decided that it should attribute these agreements with a 2-year transition period for existing JSAs, as we had done for radio. Finally, I can provide a bit of context for the Media Bureau's public notice in March, which gave guidance to the industry on how the Bureau will process pending and future TV license transfer applications. In releasing the public notice, the Bureau sought to provide greater transparency to the industry about concerns that had come to light in our review of proposed license transfers. Transactions we've seen in recent years have involved increasingly complex relationships between stations that our rules do not allow to be jointly owned. In particular, more and more transactions involve combinations of sharing arrangements and financial ties such as options and loan guarantees. We have found that determining the economic effects of a transaction requires much more extensive analysis when stations have such complex entanglements. And though we must decide each case on its particular facts, case-by-case decisions by themselves may not give broadcasters the predictability they want as they structure deals. The public notice is intended to increase transparency by making sure that broadcasters appreciate that deals involving complex interrelationships require more extensive review, and by highlighting the combinations of relationships that we have found most troubling as we evaluate whether one station may have undue influence over another. By arming the parties with this knowledge, we sought to guide them as they structure future deals or consider amendments to pending transactions. From what we've seen so far, this increased transparency has been helpful. Far from coming to a halt, deal-making in the industry continues. Since mid-March, we have approved the sale of 36 full-power stations representing 12 different deals. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Mr. Lake, thank you for your service and for your testimony. We look forward to continuing the discussion. We'll now go to Jessica J. Gonzalez, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the National Hispanic Media Coalition. Ms. Gonzalez, thank you for being here. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Issue, and members of the subcommittee. I represent the National Hispanic Media Coalition, a media advocacy and civil rights organization working towards a media that is fair, inclusive, and accessible to all people. What happens in an overly consolidated media system that fails to reflect American multiculturalism? Here's an example from the radio industry, which is already plagued by major consolidation. On Clear Channel radio stations across the country, listeners are fed a steady diet of racism and stereotyping. According to some Clear Channel pundits, Latinos and African Americans are dangerous, Asians are cheaters, women are sluts, immigrants are animals. At a time when this country should be developing its proud multicultural identity, instead, this dehumanization of women and people of color is normalized over the public airwaves. We as parents of young children of color and young girls have to figure out how to explain these slurs to our children who don't see color, but yet are told at a young age that they are different, or they are feared, or they are less than. The harms of this rhetoric are deep and well documented. Clear Channel has 850 plus stations in over 150 cities across the country. It exploits the lack of strong radio ownership limits to insulate its stations from free market accountability mechanisms, such as losing audience share or revenue. It is totally out of touch with the communities it serves. Media ownership limits are vital to the health of our democracy. These content and race-neutral rules promote ownership diversity, viewpoint diversity, localism, and competition. Broadcasters and newspapers play a critically important role in informing Americans and influencing attitudes towards people of color and women. Broadcast TV and radio reach over 98% of us, and reliance on over-the-air TV is prevalent in poor, rural, and non-English speaking communities. Internet sources are far from achieving parity with broadcasters when it comes to disseminating information, particularly local news. First of all, 1 in 3 Americans does not have home broadband access. Rural communities, Latinos, African Americans, seniors, the poor, people with disabilities, and non-English speakers are far less likely to be connected to the internet. And traditional media sources like broadcasting and newspapers are still responsible for the vast majority of online local news and information. The courts, Congress, and the FCC have long recognized a nexus between minority ownership and broadcasting diversity. Yet, people of color, who make up more than 36% of the U.S. population, own less than 3% of TV stations. Women own less than 7%. Media consolidation and joint sales agreements that allow big media companies to circumvent the ownership rules are bad for diversity. Immediately after the 1996 Act relaxed ownership limits and the minority tax certificate was abandoned, women and people of color were pushed from the market as conglomerates grew. According to a 1997 NTIA report, relaxed ownership limits created a significant competitive advantage for group owners who are more likely to be non-diverse and have greater financial resources. That media concentration drove up station prices. The FCC's recent JSA ruling, on the other hand, creates opportunities for diverse owners and small businesses to enter the market. NHMC envisions a country in which broadcasters reflect American multiculturalism and serve the information needs of all communities, promoting diversity and localism with strong media ownership rules within the FCC's existing regulatory framework, and using your lawmaking power to reinstate the minority tax certificate are important steps towards achieving that vision. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Ms. Gonzalez, thank you for your powerful testimony. We appreciate your comments. We'll now turn to Mr. Bernard Lunzer, President of the Newspaper Guild, CWA. Mr. Lunzer, thank you for being here. We look forward to your testimony as well, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and the committee for allowing me to testify. The News Guild CWA represents workers in broadcast, print, and digital. Our sister sector, NABET CWA, represents workers throughout broadcast. Along with our employer reps, some of them that are here, we seek solutions to the current challenges in media. The internet will continue its disruption of media while also offering room for innovation and new revenue. Right now, there are no simple solutions or clear ways forward. We support Chairman Wheeler's stated intent to rein in JSAs, study shared service agreements, and maintain the status quo on cross-ownership between print and broadcast. Further consolidation will not help. It's not about saving call letters, mastheads, or websites if they only duplicate information from elsewhere. JSAs, SSAs, and more cross-ownership will result in fewer employees, less news coverage, and less diversity in both areas. It also will not stimulate diversity in ownership. Already, JSAs and SSAs have substantially reduced coverage in towns like Youngstown, Ohio, and Honolulu, Hawaii. In Youngstown, for example, 4 TV stations are operated by Lynn Media, with duplicated material being presented on those stations. Lynn Media is in competition with 2 other stations that are owned and operated in conjunction with the Youngstown Vindicator newspaper. When Lynn consolidated stations, it eliminated most newsroom jobs in the accredited newsrooms. The Vindicator and its broadcast stations have small staffs in their newsrooms and share material. Overall, employment has shrunk and diversity of coverage as well. Cable, by the way, adds almost nothing locally. We're often told that combinations allow for more coverage. That's just not the case, as the efficiencies are used purely to increase profitability through less staff. Honolulu is a similar case to Youngstown and well documented. 3 of 5 stations operate as if they were a single news operation with almost identical news, significantly diminishing local coverage. In Syracuse, New York, and Peoria, Illinois, Granite and Barrington Broadcasting swapped and combined news operations in each city. Our union commissioned a national study done by the University of Delaware. The study reported that 70 workers were laid off and 16 were reassigned. Barrington Broadcasting now runs 3 stations in Syracuse with the same news staff. The Syracuse and Peoria markets both lost competing and different points of view in news coverage through duplication. We get to a situation where some broadcast stations are essentially zombies. Broadcasting continues, but there are few, if any, employees involved. The JSAs allow for consolidation on the advertising side. We believe the goal of restricting JSAs where more than 15% of sales are attributed to another station is a good one. We also agree with the FCC about studying SSAs to see if similar restrictions would be in order. There needs to be a procedure and a test to revive such stations, allowing for more hiring, diversity of coverage, and the potential for diversity of ownership. The FCC is on the right track if that really is the goal. Again, further concentration will make this worse. The status quo continues the current dilemma. Only new guidelines will provide for a better competition and a robust landscape that may allow for diversity of ownership, which is at scandalous levels, as has already been discussed here. Let me also strike at the heart of the myth of diverse content, because the internet is adding so many voices. This is a very important point. Much of what the internet has added is opinion, not well-sourced, and not particularly helpful. A Pew study of Baltimore, a Tribune paper, in 2012 demonstrated that although there were 53 news outlets for local content, 83% of stories were repetitive with no new information. Legacy print content providers accounted for 48% of content, with local broadcast providing about 1/3. Almost no breaking information came from the non-legacy platforms. Since the study, the Sun, the Baltimore Sun, the principal provider of news, has shrunk substantially. As a labor union that cares deeply about democracy, we believe further concentration will mean less credible news and information to citizens as major debates take place over the future of America. Citizens should expect their rights to be paramount over broadcasters, as has been established in law. We need real innovation and investment as we continue forward in the 21st century. Consolidating existing organizations with fewer employees does not get us there. I would also note that the breaking news last night on the Virginia election, I got that through a print source that actually came in through a tweet. The original news actually came from a print organization. I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Mr. Boyle, you are now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Congressman Terry, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of our 2,000+ member newspapers, thank you for providing this opportunity to testify. The subcommittee's focus on media ownership in the 21st century is appropriate. Many of our ownership regulations are creatures of the 20th century and are no longer suitable for today's multimedia world. My testimony will focus on one such outdated regulation, the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban. The FCC adopted this ban in 1975. The rule prohibits investors from owning both a daily newspaper and a television or radio station in the same market. At the time, the Commission feared that one owner could control all of the news and editorial viewpoints in a community. Many ideas that sounded perfectly reasonable in 1975 now appear behind the times. Those were the days of a single nationwide telephone company, gasoline rationing, and bell-bottoms. Today's media ownership regulations must reflect today's media. You recognized this need when, in 1996, you required the FCC to conduct a comprehensive review of its media ownership regulations every 4 years and to repeal or modify any regulation that it determines to be no longer in the public interest. Well, NAA is getting ready to file comments in the Commission's 8th proceeding in nearly 20 years, examining the validity of the 1975 cross-ownership ban. Remarkably, none of these proceedings has resulted in any changes in the rule, creating an endless cycle of regulatory uncertainty for newspapers and broadcasters. We all know that American consumers have access to more information and viewpoints today than ever before. According to a recent report on the personal news cycle, the average American recalled getting her news from between 4 and 5 different sources in a week. And new digital news players have exploded on the scene. This same report found that nearly half of those surveyed received their news from online-only reporting sources. Quite simply, there are no longer any barriers to entry in the distribution of news and information. However, in-depth, investigative, original reporting that is professionally edited takes a substantial commitment of resources. Newspapers have always made this commitment. Some have argued that the repeal of the cross-ownership ban will lead to a massive wave of mergers. Nothing could be further from the truth. But in light of rapid changes in media consumption, some newspapers likely will come on the market. The ban reduces the number of potential buyers who might want to invest in a newspaper, including an owner of a broadcast station with deep resources and a commitment to journalism. And when local television or radio stations become available for sale, the only media companies that are barred from bidding on them are newspaper companies. Companies that have had a long history of producing local news in that community. Some of the nation's top journalism has occurred in communities that have cross-owned newspapers and broadcast stations. For example, 2 of the primary news sources that broke and dug deep into the story about mismanagement at the Department of Veterans Affairs were newspaper-television combinations in Arizona and Ohio. This is not a surprise. Public service journalism is a part of their DNA. According to FCC Commission research, a cross-owned television station produces 50% more local news, devotes 40% more time to candidate speeches, and airs 30% more coverage of state and local political candidates. Removing the cross-ownership restriction would serve, not harm, communities. It is time to eliminate this barrier that has stifled much-needed investment in local journalism. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Boyle, thank you for your testimony. We'll now go to Mr. David Bank, who's the Managing Director of RBC Capital Markets. Mr. Bank, we especially appreciate your testimony today and look forward to hearing it. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Okay, good morning.
You have to push that little button right there in front. There it'll go.
It shows my lack of governmental experience. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. My name is David Bank, and I'm a Managing Director and the Equity Research Analyst responsible for covering the media sector at RBC Capital Markets. RBC Capital Markets is the corporate and investment banking arm of the Royal Bank of Canada, Canada's largest bank and the 12th largest bank in the world based upon market capitalization. I primarily advise institutional clients such as pension funds and mutual fund managers with respect to broader themes and specific company fundamentals in the media industry. I help advise investors with respect to how they should be positioned in the media space given current and future industry dynamics. I've covered the media space for approximately the last 15 years, during which a tremendous amount of change has occurred in the broad media landscape, especially with respect to three things. The first, how consumers apportion their time consuming different media. The second, the new media outlets that have become available to those consumers. And third, the business models available to those operators and the competitive forces within the media space. Much has already been made of the fact that the current regulatory framework for media ownership dates back to 1975 for newspaper cross-ownership and basically to the late 20th century for much of the framework for TV and radio broadcast with respect to both cross-ownership and single media ownership concentration across single markets as well as in the U.S. in totality. The financial markets, the capital markets, are keenly aware that this regulatory framework was created before the dynamically changing nature of the media ecosystem that has overtaken us at light speed over the past few years had been developed. The financial and capital markets are even more keenly aware that consumer behavior itself has changed massively as a result of the evolving ecosystem. Specifically, the current regulatory framework was constructed in a media ecosystem that basically didn't include the internet. While it may have contemplated a broad PC-based internet consumption environment, it certainly didn't contemplate a mobile application-based ecosystem. For an illustration of this point, I would ask you to look at Exhibit 1. As you can see, hopefully, from this exhibit, about 45% of consumers' media time is now spent on either the internet, on PC, or some sort of mobile application. That's 45%. We think this is a reasonable starting point to view the framework through which we might want to evaluate the relevance of current rules to the existing ecosystem. In terms of traditional media, there is probably no surprise that consumers still spend more of their time with television than any other medium, as they have for decades, including the time period in which the current regulatory framework was constructed. However, the consumption within the TV paradigm has shifted greatly in a way not necessarily reflected in a regulatory paradigm shift. The primary shift has been the consumption of TV moving meaningfully from a world dominated by broadcast content to an increasingly fragmented one where the American viewer now consumes the majority of TV content from dual-stream advertiser and subscription fee-supported cable channels. Exhibit 2 illustrates, even 10 years ago, the majority of adult 18 to 49 primetime audiences was not on the big four networks, but rather skewed slightly more toward non-broadcast. Today, that shift is even more pronounced, with broadcast controlling only about a third of the primetime audience. As a result, it's clear to us that broadcast TV regulation should probably consider a framework in which pay TV in total as an ecosystem is a competitor. This is the case in small and big markets alike. Further, TV isn't the only medium that has seen an increased fragmentation in audience over the past 15 years. The radio ecosystem has clearly undergone an evolution beyond simply a broadcast transmitter since the time when the regulatory framework was constructed. Broadcast radio has probably been less impacted by the advent of traditional subscription services, such as Sirius satellite radio, than the television ecosystem, despite the fact that Sirius has 26 million paying subs today, with millions more of trials and inactive radios currently on the road just waiting to be activated. This has eaten into traditional radio's share of the audience on some level, but radio has been more directly impacted by the advent of the internet, with services such as Pandora, Spotify, or download and podcast services on iTunes, especially on a non-subscription basis. Simply considering digital radio services offers a framework for which the world has dramatically changed. Digital's audience skews younger, but the trend of total population penetration is irrefutable, as illustrated in Exhibit 3. Digital radio listeners are now at mass market proportions, representing just more than half the population and 2/3 of internet users. Clearly, the game has changed in radio with respect to consumer behavior. This has also put some pressure on the typical radio business model. The newspaper business model is not a major focus in our coverage universe, but it's quite clear that the industry has undergone a great deal of tumult, in no small part due to changes in consumer behavior and alternatives as well. Most specifically, consumers simply have more choices with respect to how to consume news. In 1975, when the newspaper TV cross-ownership rules were essentially constructed, consumers had no digital or cable news choices. By 2003, over 10 years ago, consumers were getting 20% of their news from online sources. Today, that figure is around 40%, as illustrated in Exhibit 4. That is an astounding change in consumer behavior, having a material impact on the ecosystem. The bottom line regarding these shifts in the ecosystem is that they seem to call into relief what some of the existing regulatory framework might not. Digital media has now created, at least on the macro level, a powerful competitor to the media ecosystem that existed in isolation in the prior century. The markets are keenly aware of it. It plays a significant role in the way they fund growth in choices that consumers have. That said, there have been some movements more recently on the part of the FCC to re-regulate some elements of media ownership and ownership concentration issues in the TV landscape in particular. The merits of these rule changes specifically aren't what we'd focus on in this venue, but rather we'd put the focus on the isolated nature of the rule changes without consideration to adjacent issues. For instance, the UHF discount itself is probably something increasingly obsolete in an evolved ecosystem where most people under the age of 40 couldn't tell you the difference between a UHF or a VHF station. There is no separate dial on the cable box. But rather, the choice to address such changes on a piecemeal basis adds limited visibility to the financial marketplace. The financial markets would probably have found it more constructive to view the UHF discount rule considered in a broader framework related to overall ownership cap regulation. The financial markets sometimes struggle with how to interpret broader ramifications. That concludes my prepared remarks. I'd like to thank Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and the subcommittee members for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Bank. We appreciate your testimony. Thanks for coming down. We'll now turn to Jane Mago, who's the Executive Vice President, General Counsel, Legal and Regulatory Affairs of the National Association of Broadcasters, for our final testimony from our witness today. Ms. Mago, thanks for being back before the subcommittee. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the invitation to speak to you this morning. Let me put my spin on 1975, that year that we've been talking about all morning here. In 1975, I was starting law school, watching a black and white television with no remote control, and like everyone else, I had only 3 broadcast networks to choose from. Cable wasn't available to me, and satellite television was only delivered to huge earth stations that were owned by cable companies. That was the world when some of these broadcast ownership regulations were created. Since then, we have cable and satellite and telecommunications companies that are all offering video services. The Internet and the massive proliferation of news outlets that you've heard about this morning have absolutely revolutionized the way we consume media. Yet time has seemingly stood still at the FCC. The current broadcast ownership rules are simply out of touch with the reality of today's media marketplace. They distort competition. Cable, satellite, and Internet-based media outlets who operate without these cumbersome regulations continue to proliferate and take both audience share and advertising revenues. The local television rule, for example, which generally prohibits the ownership of two television stations in the same market, assumes that television broadcasters operate in a bubble, only competing against other television broadcasters. That's almost laughable in today's marketplace. One need only look at the growing cable practice of selling local advertising across hundreds of cable programs to understand that there is a direct and real competition between broadcast and cable. The FCC has recently decided to effectively prohibit two broadcast stations from engaging in the joint sale of advertising. But the large cable operators, along with satellite companies and AT&T and Verizon, have been unimpeded as they join forces to create a single source that jointly sells local television advertising. It's increasingly difficult for broadcasters to compete in a marketplace that is so skewed by disparate regulation. The 1975 newspaper cross-ownership rule that we've heard about this morning also relies on assumptions of a media landscape from a bygone era. The FCC itself has said that the prohibition against newspaper broadcast cross-ownership is not necessary to advance its goals of localism and competition, and it has recognized that the rule is overly broad as related to the alleged goal of promoting viewpoint diversity, particularly with regard to radio. Yet, this outdated rule is still on the books. To maintain the ability to provide quality local service and compete with newer technologies, broadcasters need a more level playing field with our competitors. That leads to my second point. Broadcast ownership rules must keep pace with market changes. Congress wisely required the FCC to take a fresh look at the ownership rules on a regular basis in light of competition and repeal or modify those that no longer serve the public interest. But the FCC has failed to follow your direction. The last review was done in 2007, and rather than complete the most recent quadrennial review as required by statute, the Commission rolled its 2010 review into 2014, and then announced that it would not likely complete that review until at least mid-2016. NAB is challenging this most recent FCC decision in court, not just because the FCC failed to live up to its statutory obligation, but also because the Commission is imposing new restrictions on joint sales agreements among television stations, despite the fact that these agreements have produced tangible public interest benefits. NAB has shown that these agreements produce more news, more foreign language television, and other community-focused programming. Amazingly, the new rules will force broadcasters to unwind agreements that the Commission had previously approved. Finally, consideration of the broadcast ownership rules must be based on real evidence, not speculation. To address this, NAB asks Congress to undertake an examination of how the FCC's administration of the broadcast ownership rules has stifled investment and opportunity in broadcasting. In this time of intense consolidation in other parts of the communications industry, these ownership rules are increasingly outdated and have significant harmful consequences on local media. Regulatory practices that starve media of capital investment are a proven failure. They serve no one, not current broadcasters, not interested new entrants, and most importantly, not the American people. In sum, NAB is asking for you to ensure timely and fair revision of the broadcast ownership rules. Maintaining the status quo, creating new restrictions, or even just kicking the can down the road is a disservice to the American people. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Mago, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it, and we thank all of you for sharing your thoughts with us today. We'll go now into the Q&A portion of our hearing. So, Mr. Lake, in the SiriusXM merger in 2008, the Justice Department acknowledged that satellite radio services do not just compete with each other, but with a broad array of possible consumer substitutes, including AM and FM radio, CDs, iPods, and other MP3 players. And as you know, many new cars now have docking stations or Bluetooth capability to connect all that up with other audio services, including internet radio webcasting over Wi-Fi, cell phones, and other handheld wireless devices, and the new digital HD radio receivers, which allow old-fashioned broadcasters to send up to 3 digital channels of programming over AM and FM bands, bundled together with the excellent analog channel. Terrestrial broadcasters now contend with Spotify and Pandora and other services, so it's a much-changed audio market in terms of competition for ears. What's the delay? How do you justify not changing the radio rules on ownership?
We have looked very carefully at that in our 2010 review, compiled a great record, and we are looking at those trends in the use of radio and other audio sources. They haven't indicated to us yet that we should change the local radio rules.
Really?
Again, we have just called for further input. We're very interested in knowing how
have you changed anything relative to the radio rules since 1996?
No, those rules have not been changed since Congress put the current.
Do you think the market has changed since 1996 in terms of audio offerings and competition in the audio marketplace?
The entire marketplace has changed, both audio and
But
video.
the rules have
And
not.
Our task is to try to determine at the current state of evolution, what are the appropriate rules. And again, we're very open to all input on that subject.
Because I sense from your testimony you're not. I mean, it kind of indicates you're going to go with the existing rules. Right?
What we've done, I think, is to analyze the record as it now stands. We have a very extensive record, but we're very open to further input. And I think if you read the further notice carefully, it says what it says, which is that we're open to all further input. All of the issues are open.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that because, as you know, I was a radio broadcaster. We had to do the Olympic ring theory to justify having 2 AMs and 3 FMs in a market that was, I don't know, several hundred square miles probably. And I always had competition with XM and Sirius. That was really before Pandora took off. I've got 5 audio platforms out there. And you all allow, and Justice allowed XM and Sirius to merge and said, here's the marketplace as we see it. And then for broadcasters, you say, oh, no, you can't have another platform in a market. We frankly rescued some stations that were in pretty bad shape and restored local programming, split them apart. And I just think you guys don't get it, that the marketplace has changed dramatically. And the statute requires you to get it. And here we've been a quadrennial review, and for a whole set of reasons, not yours, you don't have a vote at the commission, so I'm picking on you, but not really, okay? But the message will get through because I imagine the commissioners listen in occasionally. And I just wonder, television has changed, newspapers are going broke. Craigslist has done amazing things to classified advertising. Mr. Lunzer, you probably don't have a lot of people working in the classified ad bureau anymore, do you? And a lot of it was propped up by legal notice requirements through the housing crash with foreclosures. That made up a lot of revenue, but that's going away. And I worry about future newspapers. I don't even like what they write about me sometimes, and I still worry about them. Some of the time, yeah, well. But the point is, it's a vibrant marketplace, and I think our rules are outdated. And so, again, I worry about what you're doing with the JSAs, because I sense from your testimony, Mr. Lake, it's almost like you think that the sales department controls the news department.
The conclusion we reached with respect to both radio and TV JSAs is that if one station controls the principal source of revenue for another, it's likely to have an influence on the ability to influence the conduct of the second station. And that's the test under our attribution rules.
Huh. Okay. I'd like to go to Ms. Mago. You said that that because of some consolidation, the market's actually better served. What's your evidence for that?
We showed a number of different markets where there was the specific advantages that came from the shared services arrangements. For example, in Wichita, Kansas, stations were able, through a JSA combination, to provide the first Spanish language news in the entire state of Kansas. Similarly, in a situation in Eureka, California, you had 2 stations that didn't have any local news at all. By combining their resources to be able to get the efficiencies that came through those shared operations, both were able to start news operations in the Eureka market, where there'd only been one before that, and that's something that was a great advantage to the communities.
All right, my time's expired. Thank you all for your testimony and the work you do in this area. Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each one of our guests today. Varying views, and I listened hard to what each one of you said, and I can't help but think that some of my thinking relative to what some of the testimony is the opposite of what you said. And so I want to go the other way and test out some of the things that have been put out about how great media consolidation is and how well it serves our country. I started out today by stating, I think, one of the most important principles relative to a democracy. Now, our democracy is old. India's, I think, is large and vibrant as well. But would anyone suggest that because that's an old idea, it's a bad one, that we should take up something that would change the whole idea of democracy? I don't think so. So while I celebrate the new platforms, the new services, so many of them, I'd be willing to wager the majority of them being established in my congressional district, that we need to examine this in terms of what consolidation is actually going to do for the American people. I understand business models, capital markets, how they want to invest, what's going to serve them well. In many ways, many of those business approaches were blown apart in 2008 when we had a near total economic collapse in our country. That was one hell of a business model that was brought to the American people. So I think that, it's been said that, nothing has changed since 1975. We're out of touch with ourselves and markets and what we need to do. I would suggest that some of the business models are out of touch with what the American people should be receiving. I don't know who's going to stand next to the model that Ms. Gonzalez described. I mean, that is really, as the chairman said, powerful testimony. So if we consolidate more, are minorities in our country going to progress? No one addressed that. I never heard anyone address that. So if you have some points to make on that, I think it would be terrific. But honestly, I just don't, I think that people care. They care enormously if in their market there's one outfit that owns a newspaper, runs the TV stations and the radio stations. What kind of line of information, what's the value and the texture and the fabric and the content of just that one line being fed to people? I think that there are some countries in the world where we shun and make fun of that model because there's one line to people. I want to hear diversity of thinking. And I would suggest that there's a lot of junk out there too, even though we have many more things at our fingertips. And for the broadcasters, God bless you. You do a lot of things for in terms of localism. We've had testimony on that. But you also have the airwaves that belong to the American people, and you don't pay for that. So that's a pretty darn good deal. So why would I want to consolidate something even more? For what? What's the reason? I mean, what's the prime reason? Anyone have an answer to that? What's the prime reason? Is it for a better business model for someone? Or is this in the name of democracy, localism, diversity, competition? I mean, I think that's the central question here.
If I can, Ranking Member Eshoo, I think I would like to put the right perspective on this of what we want And what broadcasters are calling for is a healthy, vibrant broadcast industry, and I think it can achieve all of those goals that you were just talking about.
Yeah, well, I don't know how, though. That's
By
the point, yeah.
being able to compete in the current ecosystem. You cannot simply look at the broadcast industry as if it's only in its own little bubble. You have to recognize all of the changes that we talked about here this morning and recognize that for broadcasters to be able to provide the kind of local information, the kind of truly competitive services that we have to have the kind
Yeah, well,
of
I
combinations
appreciate
that
your
reach
jumping
that.
in, and I'm over my time. I think it's very interesting today that there's not a camera here. We have print media that's here, but I don't know. Are we
Cameras right up
webcast
there.
or?
Sure, of course.
That we are on
I assume.
C-SPAN?
Yeah.
C-SPAN carrying
It's
this?
up to them to carry it or not. We
I
don't
see.
dictate it.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm proud that the print
We got
media
print
is
over here. We
here,
got print.
so
Raise
thank
your
you.
hand if you're
I
from the
didn't,
news
I'll
media.
submit my questions to you, but I really think, Mr. Chairman, that when you look across America, we really have to understand what more consolidation is going to do. And myself, I don't think it really feeds democracy simply to consolidate because that's someone's business plan. I just don't buy that. I've seen a lot of people's lives wrecked and bad information being put out in the region as a result of it. I don't want more than that. So thank you very much, and I'll submit my questions to the witnesses for their response. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. And now we'll go to Mr. Latta, the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks for our panel for being with us today. Appreciate your testimony. Ms. Mago, if I could start with you at this time. What would be the effect of the FCC's proposal to attribute stations under a JSA in calculating a broadcaster's media ownership cap?
For many of the stations that have been operating under the JSAs that were in fact approved by the Commission, it's going to mean that they're going to have to unwind those operations within the 2 years, as Mr. Lake described. And that means that they're going to have to either go out of business, they're going to have to find other sources of revenues, because those efficiencies that they've been operating under have been what have allowed them to provide greater service to their communities. So there's going to be a reduction of the amount of the service that's available in the communities.
Okay, yeah, that's the next part of the question then. What effect would that have when you're looking at a reduction for services in that community or communities? What would you see that as?
I see that as harmful to the American public. And that reduction, it can be that, for example, where you have the stations, the station that I referred to before in Wichita, Kansas, where the Spanish news operation is being facilitated by the fact that there is a joint sales agreement that's in that market. That might well have to go away or find some other way of being financed that would not give it this kind of resources that they need. Other markets have similar stories that go with it, where the Tougaloo College is also operating under a JSA, and they have presented evidence to the Commission that they would not be able to provide the services that they could to their community.
Thank you. Mr. Lake, you noted in your testimony under the further notice tentatively affirms that media ownership limits remain necessary in the current marketplace despite the prevalence of new electronic media. So, and how is the FCC making that determination without first having conducted a thorough review of the marketplace to justify those limits?
We looked at the record as it now exists, and while my friend Jane is right that the market has evolved quite a bit since she began law school, it continues to evolve. I'm sure it will be very different 5 years or 10 years from now, and our task is to try to determine what rules are appropriate for the current state of evolution. And one of the things that we find in the current record is that while distribution of news, local news and information in particular, has become much more diverse. People find it on the internet and elsewhere. The sources of that news and information remain principally the traditional media, newspapers and broadcast television. We also note that while broadband is changing everything in the country, there remains about 30% of the population that doesn't have broadband at home. In 5 years or 10 years, if that figure is much closer to 100%, and if the electronic media are generating more original news than they do today, that might have tremendous implications for our media ownership rules. What we're trying to do is to look at the state of the market today and decide what rules are appropriate to the market today. And as I say, we're basing our tentative conclusions on the 2010 quadrennial record, but we've invited comments on our further notice, and we'll look very carefully at the updated information that people submit.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Mr. Bank, if no changes are made to the current regulatory system and the ownership caps remain where they are today, what's your prediction for the world of traditional media in the next 5 years?
Well, what I would say is that the perspective of the capital markets on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, is the intense, increasing competition that's being ratcheted up by a competing ecosystem from the online media world. I think that over that period of time, over a 5-year period of time, we would expect to see continued wallet and mind share loss by the traditional media players to online media. I don't think they're going out of business in the traditional media world, but I think it's going to be a less, it risks being a less healthy environment, and because of that, the capital markets will have to evaluate how they're willing to fund growth in that area.
Let me follow up with your testimony is very helpful in showing us the trends in today's media consumption. What does that mean to the investment community overall when you look at that?
I'm sorry, what?
Well, when you look at the trends that you're talking about, what does it mean to the investment community when you're looking at today's world out there and into the next few 4 to 5 years?
I think again the focus of the capital markets is to invest for the greatest potential return, and that is often connected with the long-term growth perspective. And I think if you look at a lot of those exhibits, what you see is, on some level, a decline of share potentially going from traditional media to online, and typically dollars will follow that share, whether it's advertising revenue, viewership, whatever it is you can measure. I think those are the kinds of things that capital tends to chase.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his questions and you for your answers. We'll now go to Mr. Luan from New Mexico. Thank you for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Boyle, with your recommendation to eliminate the ban, are there any restrictions that you would replace the ban with?
No, we think that the ban should be fully eliminated for radio, newspaper combinations, but also TV newspaper combinations. It makes no sense that a top-rated television station in a market that has resources and a deep commitment to journalism can't invest in a local newspaper in that market if that newspaper becomes available. Investigative, original reporting that's professionally edited is very expensive to do. And we don't think there's going to be a massive wave of mergers. There may be some markets that a newspaper comes on the scene. And we think for too long, investors have been on the sidelines.
Well, Mr. Boyle, well, I have concerns with the response, and with this reason. If there are no restrictions, I don't see anything that keeps one entity from controlling everything. And we only get news from one source. And that's where my concern is. And that's why I was hoping that I would hear some restrictions. But maybe we can have a conversation about that later. I only have a few minutes. I'm going to move on. Ms. Mago, I appreciate very much the remarks bringing attention to an outdated rule, an era, a bygone era, a marketplace that has changed dramatically with rules that were put in place in the 70s. Should we get rid of DMAs?
I'm sorry?
Should we get rid of DMAs?
The DMAs are actually fairly current. They reflect the market patterns in any given.
DMAs were put in place in the 50s and 40s and 50s.
The designated market areas are something that has been created through the Nielsen services. In fact, they're adapted as you go along.
So
that indicate.
If I may, so we should get rid of an antiquated rule that was written in the 70s, but not antiquated rules that were written before then.
No, sir. I'm contesting the notion that it is simply that the DMAs have not changed. In fact, they do change. and they're reflective of the market patterns and the commerce that is within any given area.
So DMAs create a bubble.
I'm sorry?
DMAs create a bubble for broadcasters to operate in, correct?
No, they reflect the markets where the broadcasters are in fact operating. They are the commerce area around where the broadcasters and the others in that market are. They reflect the businesses that advertise on whatever broadcasting service is there, and they in fact are updated.
Very good. That's another conversation I hope that we can have.
I'd be happy to talk with you more about that.
Well, yeah, all that we've learned about that, where there's local communities all around the United States and orphan counties that don't get local broadcast news. So clearly, something's broken. When local rural Americans are left out in the dark and don't know what's happening in their backyard, and when local newspapers aren't providing coverage up there because it's too far to commute to take a local newspaper. I come from a state where my legislative district takes 8.5 hours to drive across. Out here, I drive through 6 or 7 states. But people seem to forget about rural America, and that's where my concern is in that particular area. But we'll
be happy to talk with you more about that and really address your concerns.
I appreciate that. Ms. Gonzalez, you noted in your testimony that since 2006, there's been nearly an 80% decrease in full-power TV station ownership by African Americans. Some may use that number to argue that existing media cross-ownership rules have done little to preserve diversity in broadcast ownership. I find it interesting, however, that over roughly the same period, the use of GSAs by broadcasters has grown substantially. For example, data indicates that while GSAs were only found in 4% of the ownership transfer applications pending before the FCC between 2001 and 2004, by earlier this year had ballooned to 25%. Based on these figures, do you think there's a correlation between the tremendous uptick in the use of GSAs that in many instances help broadcasters go around the media cross-ownership restrictions and the decline in minority ownership of broadcast TV stations?
Yes, there seems to be a correlation. I will note in Ms. Mago's testimony, she mentioned one example in Kansas where there is a JSA that's providing Spanish language news that didn't otherwise exist in that DMA. I think that example is a prime candidate for the waiver process that the FCC articulated in its JSA order several months ago. And, but for the most part, these GSAs seem, and the consolidation generally, seem to have been diminishing owners of color, making it more difficult for us to enter the market, and all around just not a good situation for diversity. And in fact, there's also examples of JSAs where there is an owner of color involved, but that person doesn't have control of the programming and a path towards full ownership of the station. We want genuine involvement and ownership by people of color. That doesn't seem to be happening in this current marketplace.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I know that I have not heard any of my colleagues say anything to the contrary, that we don't want to see more ownership with minorities as well. And I think this is an important question that I hope that we can flesh out and just get more information on as we have the conversation pertaining to GSAs as well. And I really appreciate the panel that you've put together and the responses today. I still have many questions as well that we'll submit into the record. But again, thank you for bringing this panel together, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Eshoo. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for your participation. We'll now go to Mr. Kinzinger from Illinois.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here on these very important issues. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Lake. I got just a couple of kind of quick questions. The last time that the media ownership rules were substantively updated was 1999. That was quite literally the last century, and in the ensuing 15 years, the media landscape, and specifically the options people have to obtain and consume information, have expanded exponentially. It's largely thanks to the internet and the availability of online mediums. It's become apparent that the FCC is either unable or unwilling to complete the congressionally mandated media ownership review. Is Congress going to have to rewrite and deregulate the current media ownership rules to finally match the intent of the 1996 Telecommunications Act and to finally provide regulations that match the realities of the current media landscape?
I can say the Commission takes very seriously its responsibility to review the ownership rules, and the current chairman has committed to take a very serious look and to have recommendations for the commissioners by mid-2016.
Good, and I hope you can take back the concerns of the committee on that. very loudly. And Mr. Lake, the Commission adopted an expedited process to review requests for waivers of the recently adopted JSA rules. As you noted, the Bureau is tasked with acting on any waiver request within 90 days of the close of the record, provided there are no circumstances requiring additional time for review. Could you describe what those circumstances are, and how will applicants know that such circumstances exist?
We haven't confronted circumstances such as that, and I don't know what they might be. They might be a need for further information that hasn't been available, but we don't anticipate that that circumstance will happen very often. We're very much aware of the commitment we have to act, if at all possible, within 90 days after the record closes, and that's what we'll try to do.
And so if there is a circumstance, will you guys be communicating this well to the applicants?
Absolutely. If we identify such a circumstance, we'll make clear what that is.
And will they know immediately?
We might not know except during that 90-day period, but again, I think this is very hypothetical because we don't anticipate that that will occur very frequently.
And how will this new speed of disposal metric be incorporated into the management of the Bureau? What happens if it's not met, and will you commit to seeing this deadline met?
Excuse me, will we commit
to seeing this deadline, to seeing any deadlines
Yes,
met?
we are committed to meeting that deadline if at all possible. And again, I don't anticipate there will be many circumstances in which it's not.
Okay. Ms. Mago, the FCC has an open proceeding to do away with the UHF discount in terms of how UHF stations are counted against the national broadcast ownership cap. This discount was put into law at a time when UHF signals were seen as inferior to VHF signals, which after the digital television transition is no longer the case. Does the NAB have a position on that proceeding?
Yes, NAB's position is that you really shouldn't be looking at just the UHF discount aspect of this without looking at the larger rule regarding the national ownership cap. It makes no sense in a world where you've grown up with the various discounts, with the ownership sizes, to look at that without considering the larger rule. It's not a standalone rule.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I still have 1:30, but I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush. You know, turn on your mic.
Mr. Chairman.
We're glad to have you back, Mr. Rush.
Well, and I'm very glad to be back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all your concern for both of me and my wife. I really appreciate it. I want to welcome all the witnesses, and I want to let you know I appreciate your testimony, and I appreciate you spending this time with us to discuss the FCC media ownership rules. And this is an issue, an area of concern that I've had over the last 21 years that I've been in the Congress. And certainly in terms of my years on this committee and on this subcommittee, has been one of my primary concerns. And I'm really, I've taken a position over these past couple of decades that one of the reasons why I sit on this committee is to increase the number of minority ownership of media across the country. And I must say to you, I am dismally disappointed. I've been disappointed over a number of years because I don't see the vigorous and the I don't see the vigorous commitment from the FCC. I'm disappointed in the excuse making and the continual excuse making. And it's worse now than it's ever been in the last 20 years that I've been in this Congress. 21 years that I've been in this Congress. This is the worst time for media ownership by minorities. As a matter of fact, in the last, if I'm not mistaken, in the last 3 or 4 years, the percentage of media ownership by minorities has dropped almost 60% in the last 4 or 5 years. That's not a good report. That's a horrible report. And as we sit there are only 4 African Americans who are on television stations in the nation, in this great nation of ours. And we have an agency that is responsible for ensuring that the airways of the American people, that there is some equality and equal access, not only to content and viewership, but also from a point of view of ownership. And so my question to you, Mr. Lake, is does the FCC know how many minorities and women are employed by minorities and women broadcasters to compare to how many are hired by non-minority and non-women broadcasters? Do y'all keep that kind of information?
We do not have that employment breakdown. We have EEO rules that require all stations, regardless of their ownership, to do outreach in their employment.
Well, how do you justify in the FCC, how do you justify a decrease of 60% of minority owners?
The Commission does have a longstanding goal, as you note, of promoting minority and women ownership of broadcast stations.
No, I don't.
Share your dissatisfaction.
I don't know it because I hear about it, but I've never witnessed it. I have never seen that posture and that attitude. I've never seen that program and that commitment by any, I say most of the commissioners over there. I hear good intentions. I hear a lot of platitudes. I hear a lot of tear-jerking, but it's all fame and it's all fake. I don't see the work being done. I don't see them rolling up the sleeves and solving this problem that it should be solved. It should have been solved a long time ago, but I still just hear a lot of, we know it's from the FCC, I hear a lot of, yes, you're right, yes, it's long-standing, but how long is long-standing?
We share your dissatisfaction with the results so far, but we are taking concrete action. One of the results of our recent action on JSAs, we think, will be to open more opportunities for truly independent owners of TV stations, including minority and women owners. As you probably know, there was a list of about 30 civil rights and other public interest groups that supported our taking that action, and we hope that they are right and that we are right, that it will open opportunities for minority owners. We also recently relaxed our approach to foreign investment in broadcast stations. Again, civil rights groups urged us to do that as a way of trying to solve some of the access to capital problems that minority owners face. So we are taking concrete action. We're constantly looking for additional things we can do. We're always subject to the very strict Supreme Court rules that have been put down as to taking any action that's actually race or gender based. But again, one of the things that we did in our further notice that was recently announced was to review that constitutional law very carefully and the state of the evidence that we have, and to call for further evidence that might someday allow us to actually be able to justify to the Supreme Court taking race or gender-based action.
Mr. Chairman, I have one more question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
If I could. Have you ever heard of the Critical Information Needs Study?
Yes, I certainly have.
Why was it terminated?
The study was intended to gather data anonymously to help determine what the information needs of communities are and whether they're being met. When the current chairman took a fresh look at that study, he decided that some of the questions appeared inappropriate and he terminated the study.
Okay, again, here we go again. All right, so the study wasn't done according to maybe the standard of the new chairman, but instead of revising it, you end it. All right, instead of adapting or come up with some new questions that might have fit the standards of the chairman, you ended it. And it was a study that should take place, and the FCC was headed in the right direction. But again, you have ended that study, which would have given us information, all right, that would have been able to be used. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence. I'm so upset and angry about this. I think I should end this right now, my line of questioning. Thank you so very much, and I thank the witnesses. But please, I want to go on the record that I'm absolutely, totally disappointed in the FCC and their position on minority ownership of broadcast stations.
I would be happy to respond further on that if you want to take the time.
We need to actually move on, but Mr. Rush, thank you. I know you're passionate about this, and we all know that, and I appreciate your participation in the hearing. We'll turn now to, I believe, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do have great respect for my friend from the Chicago area, and it was important for him to get his time that he needed to finish up. I, too, am disappointed with the FCC, but not for the totally same reason. I said it in the opening statement. When federal agencies, regardless of who they are, don't comply with the law and delay, it makes it difficult for those of us in conservative areas of the country to say there's a legitimate reason to have that agency. If our government and our agencies would comply with law and be expeditious in the processing, it would make it easier. And I would just hope you would take that back to the FCC and the commissioners. That's the importance of getting these quadrennial reviews. I mean, it's got to be embarrassing to come up here and say, really, we haven't done 2010 and 2014, and yeah, we're going to get around to it. So I'm just beating a dead horse, but again, you don't make it easier for us. Let me go to Mr. Bank, please. Unless you address this in a question and answer while I was gone, because I'm up at the Health Subcommittee meeting too. I'm not sure you addressed the impact of the FCC's changes to the attribution of joint sales agreement in your statement. You may have gotten in a question, and if you did, I apologize. Can you tell us about the investment community's reaction to the FCC's recent announcement that they will force broadcasters to unwind joint sales agreements if the broadcaster finds itself over the local ownership cap?
Well, the sunsetting of the JSA provisions for some of those stations without a grandfathering provision has been certainly concerning to the capital markets. I think the capital markets were initially just kind of confused, but the reality is those are events that took value away from those companies. And I think it was reflected in the reaction of the capital markets.
Yeah, and people know who follow this committee and follow my service here. You know, I represent a third of the state of Illinois. I don't know, I may have 6 media markets. Most of them are small or medium to small markets. Without this ability, they're not broadcasting, or they're broadcasting inadequately. So the argument, so I'm very concerned, as other communities are concerned about, as Bobby's concerned about minorities, as the Hispanic community is concerned, I'm concerned about everyday news to rural America. And that's the opportunity that we're losing by what the FCC is proposing. I think Mr. Banks identified one of them. Ms. Mago, it's expensive, and this kind of ties into the whole debate. It's expensive to run a TV station or a newspaper in this day and age. I think it would be difficult to make it work. That's why I'm here and not out there trying. Mr. Walden tried in a different era, pretty much. But there are successful companies out there with proven track records and have continued to do so and do it well. Doesn't it make sense to allow good companies with good resources to put their expertise to work in failing stations or newspapers?
Absolutely. We believe that good stations can invest in their communities, create greater localism, also create more opportunities. They can invest in quality journalism, provide better service to the communities, and that's all good for the American people.
And just the stories that I know from local, small to medium-sized markets, you have helicopter access where you didn't have it before. You have real news broadcasting versus satellite in news. You might have a new state-of-the-art weather station that may be more predictive than the old one or the old station. So that point needs to be made as we do as members of Congress bring our differing voices here, try to collectively raise those concerns. Rural America cannot be left out in the ability to receive real-time, accurate information, and these agreements help them maintain that in a very competitive world. So I appreciate you all being here, and again, I apologize for not spending more time with you, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. We appreciate your participation as always. We'll now turn to Mr. Long as our final member with questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Mago, you may not be able to answer this question. As Executive Vice President and General Counsel, Legal and Regulatory Affairs of the National Association of Broadcasters, but I hope you can. Are you familiar with the program that the NAB has to encourage minority ownership of stations?
Absolutely. In fact, my other capacity at the NAB is that I am the General Counsel Advisor to the National Association of Broadcast Education Foundation, which runs the program that you're talking about.
Okay, good. Okay, this was not a setup, because I had not talked to you before, and I didn't know that you were that familiar with it, but I am familiar with that, and I'm given to understand that it's a very intense program, very successful. I've talked to people that have gone through and become owners of stations. So for my friend from Illinois, I hope you realize that the NAB is reaching out and doing a lot in that direction. My next question is for Mr. Lake. What advantage of if you have a successful broadcaster, what advantage is it of that successful broadcaster to fold into a JSA with another company? What would be his advantage? If I have a successful Rock'em Sock'em station on the air, making a lot of money, what's my advantage to fold that in with a JSA with another station?
What a number of stations seem to have concluded is that they would very much like to have a duopoly in a market in which our rules don't allow a duopoly, and that going into a JSA, which is often combined with a number of other entanglements between the stations, is a way essentially to go around our local TV rule and establish a de facto duopoly where a true duopoly or a legal duopoly wouldn't be allowed.
So it'd be good to give up a large percentage of my profits and things so I could fold into this arrangement if I'm a successful station.
Typically, these arrangements are not between two established successful stations.
Exactly. In my area, we have a station that came on the air as a UHF, and yeah, I'm old enough to remember that. And it was for all these years forward, it was kind of like Ted Mack's Amateur Hour, and there's a few of you in here old enough to remember Ted Mack. But and it was just it was going to fold. It was going to be out of business. I don't care if you would have brought in a minority owner, a non-minority owner, whoever it is. At the end of the day, these stations have to make money. They have to be successful. And I think that the message I would like for you to take back to the FCC, other than trying to do a quadrennial review in less than 10 years or something like that, would be that they need to be cognizant of these operations. The stations I'm talking about in my market, in my hometown that I'm talking about in particular, that news station that used to look like Ted Mack's Amateur Hour now is winning national awards. Now, yeah, they folded in. They closed the building they were in and tried to lease it or tried to sell it. They moved across town into a successful station. But that, I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I come from a 30-year business background. I don't come from politics. You know, I wasn't a politician before I ran for this. So at the end of the day, I did talk radio for 6 years. And I know when you do talk radio, you want to put people in those stores. You've got to be motivated to do a good show, get in there, and sell product and have people, you know, support your sponsors. So it's all about capitalism, making a profit. And I just think that if you all blow up this thing, that station that is getting all these news awards now that used to do terrible is going to be gone. Whether you bring in a minority owner or whatever kind of owner you bring in, if it's not a successful station, it's not going to work very well. So I guess another question for you would be, would you rather that these failing broadcasters, such as the one I described, go out of business than to be influenced, as you said earlier, by having a JSA with a successful broadcaster? Are you really that worried about the influence they may have? Would you rather them be out of business?
A few things in response to that. The facts of these circumstances...
Answer that question first,
Yes.
if you will. Yes or no, would you rather them be out of business?
We have expressly in our rules an opportunity for a station that's failing to obtain a waiver of our local TV rule, and we have granted failing station waivers. So if a station is failing, it doesn't have to take a backdoor of trying to become dependent on another station through a JSA. It can come in and seek a waiver. We also have indicated that we are wide open to consider waivers of the JSA attribution rule itself in appropriate circumstances. There are very different circumstances. There are circumstances in which these de facto duopolies have been established between two major network stations. Clearly not a failing station situation.
But if this failing station did a GSA with a successful station like I've described, and you blow this up or unwind it, then that station would either have to cease to exist or they'd have to go find another space across town and go back to being a failing station. I mean, it's going to be too late to come in for this waiver you're talking about, correct, or not?
It may not be too late. Again, we have entertained and granted a number of failing station waivers.
Okay. Thank you all for being here today, and I've gone over my time, so if I had any time, I'd sure yield her back.
I appreciate that. Thank the gentleman for his participation, and all of our witnesses for your testimony and answer your questions. I'm sure we may have a few more for the record that, if we do, we'll send you, and look forward to getting your response to it. Obviously, this is an issue that spans the spectrum of philosophy and the committee in a marketplace that's changing pretty dramatically and rapidly. And it's an issue we'll continue to pursue one way or another. So thank you all for your participation. We stand adjourned.